Hey Wolfpack, and welcome back. I hope all is well. I've missed you guys so much. My life's been quite busy lately, but hopefully it should be settling down soon. Now, today, we'll be reading more cannibal encounters. Now, with that said, whether you're sitting around a campfire, on the night shift, or even laying in bed, let my voice soothe your nightmares. It's good to be home, after the frankly insane events of the past month or so. There's nothing like settling back into the comfortable life of a small-town newspaper reporter. Except, of course, if that small town is Habitsville. We're prone to the strange here, though no fault of our own. Bizarre things just seem to happen. And just like clockwork, they're happening again. It came to me by word of mouth, but as far as I can tell, it started with a sign. I walked by the bakery myself just to be sure, and there it was, hanging in the window. It was small, white, and plain, but the words on it stood out in an unnatural way. Like I should have missed the phrase when I was walking by, but instead found that it commanded my absolute attention. The Butternut Bakery does not serve human flesh. An odd sort of laugh rose in my throat when I actually saw it, because up until that point, I thought Heather had lost her mind. Heather is my primary coworker at Habitsville Gazette. We're good friends and often talk about everything from our pieces for the paper to what shows we're binging on Netflix. I know her pretty well, which is why it was strange when she suddenly said something extremely out of character mid-conversation. She'd been talking about her parents coming to visit from a few towns over, and how cautious they always were when they came to Habitsville, as visitors often are. We were packing up our things for the day before we went home when she said, "My parents should be here Thursday," which is way too soon. The apartment's a mess and it's too small to fit all of us anyway. The Butternut Bakery does not serve human flesh. But how do you tell your parents they should get a hotel outside of town? I asked her what she had meant, but, as you might be able to guess, she had no idea what I was talking about. I even repeated the phrase back to her, but not a hint of recognition appeared in her eyes. I went home, and after a while, I forgot about it, but then I heard it again. Stepping outside of my house for work the following morning, I spotted my mailman, Phil, putting a few envelopes into my mailbox. I waved to him and said good morning, and like any polite person, he answered, "Good morning. The Butternut Bakery does not serve human flesh." He held his smile, as though he hadn't said anything strange, and cheerfully moved on to my neighbor's mailbox. I, however, was deeply confused. It felt like some sort of prank, though I had no idea who would orchestrate it and why. I heard it again later that day. In fact, I heard it 17 different times. Some people repeated it, some only said it once. I even have a transcript from an interview I was supposed to be doing with an old woman who just turned 102, where there, right in the middle of a sentence about her great-grandkids, was the phrase, "The Butternut Bakery does not serve human flesh." I hadn't heard it when she said it, but it was there, typed out in my notes. So, there I was, clocked out early on a Tuesday afternoon, just so I could stand in front of this bakery. I was bewildered, but not just because of the phrase, though that was bizarre on its own. I've lived in Habitsville my entire life, and not once have I heard of a place called the Butternut Bakery. And yet, after an afternoon spent wandering the streets of my own hometown, I found a new shop, right there in the middle of the main strip. It's a small building, but not so small that I would miss it. The building itself had an inviting burnt orange color, and the yellow lights inside made the entire place look warm and enticing. The smell of baked goods drifted out and over the pavement to where I stood on the other side of the street, fighting the overwhelming urge to go inside, because there was the sign, wasn't there? The Butternut Bakery does not serve human flesh. It seemed like such an odd thing for a bakery to have to clarify. Maybe it was some sort of fun reference to Sweeney Todd? That's not exactly an appetizing allusion to make to potential customers. But there was something about that sign, something about the phrase. It was like the more that I heard or read it, the less odd it seemed. The Butternut Bakery does not serve human flesh. Of course it doesn't. No bakeries do, or should. It's just good advertising to make that fact clear. I didn't see anyone walk in or out of the bakery for around 15 minutes, though plenty of people walked down the sidewalk. It was strange. Even the window shoppers that were strolling from the display to display didn't bother to stop at the bakery. It was the late afternoon when someone might want to grab a snack or a late lunch, but no one gave it a second look. They didn't even seem to notice the smell, which was becoming more distracting by the second. My stomach began to growl as I caught another nostrilful, and then I saw someone emerge from the bakery. I had to squint, and it was hard to recognize him outside of his uniform, but I could still tell. It was Phil, my mailman. He stepped out of the bakery holding a small bag and immediately began to walk down the sidewalk. I crossed the street and approached, walking behind him. "Phil!" I called out in a friendly manner. Oddly, he didn't respond. I thought perhaps he didn't hear me, so I walked faster until I was beside him. "Phil!" At the second call of his name, he stopped and turned to look at me. He smiled when he recognized me. "Oh, Mr. Singer! Funny running into you here." Thought his tone would suggest that we were having a normal run-in on the street. It was anything but the sort. There were markings drawn on his face, as though he was about to have some sort of cosmetic surgery. There were long strips drawn around his cheeks, and I could see some ink was peeking out from the circle that marked his ear. But, as it turned out, that wasn't the oddest part of Phil's appearance. I had thought it was his bag that had been dripping, something dark trailing from the door of the bakery to where we stood now. But since we had stilled, the trickle only came faster, and began to pool in a puddle around our feet. It wasn't hard to miss the source. Framed by the frayed edges of the shirt he wore, I could see that there was a large chunk of flesh missing from Phil's shoulder. Not like he had a bad wound that needed to be sewn up. There was nothing to sew. It was a scoop out of his body, and I could see the tip of his shoulder bones poking out where they connected at the socket. I didn't know what to say. There was no trace of pain on his face, and there was no signal that even he knew what he was walking around with. And oddly enough, no one on the street seemed to notice either. I had a brief rush of fear as I considered that perhaps I had lost my own sanity. Then he said it. "I've just picked up a bit of treat myself. The Butternut Bakery does not serve human flesh. I've just finished my route for the day." He unraveled the folded up opening to his bag and held it out to me. "Would you like to try?" I tore my eyes away from the gory wound on his torso, and instead peering into his bag. In the bottom, as innocent as I could be, was a medium-sized pastry. It was a pocket style, crimped around the edges, no doubt with some sort of filling inside. My stomach was turning violently now, and I just shook my head at Phil. "Suit yourself. This is the second time I've been this week. It's terrible for my diet, but it's just so good," he said with a chuckle. "The Butternut Bakery does not serve human flesh. I'll see you tomorrow morning then." With that, he turned and continued down the pavement, walking with a limp I had never known him to have before. I walked to the front of the bakery. Despite the warm glow coming from the inside, the windows were not well suited for a display. The glass had some sort of coating on it, and although I could see the light shining through and dark shapes moving around inside, I couldn't make anything out. I was so focused on seeing inside that I didn't notice when someone had opened the door. The small bell at the top jingled, and I looked up. It was Heather. I lurked forward and grabbed her by the hand. She flinched in shock, and then half laughed. "Sam! God, you scared me! The Butternut Bakery does not serve human flesh. Are you going inside?" She motioned into the open doorway, and I looked inside. It's difficult to describe what I saw inside the Butternut Bakery, mostly because the inside seen with the naked eye was strangely similar to the view through the glass. There was this hazy film over everything, and only two certain sights could be gleaned: the bright yellow light, the dark shadows moving around in the back. "You shouldn't go in there, Heather," I said, thinking of Phil's monstrous wound. "I know this sounds crazy, I know." I took a deep breath, then said, "But I think the Butternut Bakery is serving human flesh. Or at least, that's what I meant to say." I could hear the words as they came from my lips, though they were not the ones I had chosen at all. I said, "But I think the Butternut Bakery does not serve human flesh." I stood there, horrified. Heather furrowed her brow at me, one foot still on the doorstep of the building. "Yeah, Sam, I know, you told me before. The Butternut Bakery does not serve human flesh. I think it's great." I blinked. "I told you before?" The fear that was rising within me was quickly turning to panic. I had thought Heather had been the first one to say that phrase to me only a few days before, and never did I think I had said it back to her. "What? When you mentioned it a few days ago?" Her frown deepened. "You've been talking about the bakery for over a month, Sam." "I have? I mean, it's not much of a discussion. You pretty much say the same thing every time." She leaned back out the door and pointed to the sign that hung in the window. "The Butternut Bakery does not serve human flesh." As I stood there, spiraling, Heather looked down at my hand, which was still clasped firmly on her wrist. "Now, if you'll excuse me, you're being weird, and I'm hungry." This shook me from my daze. I couldn't let what had happened to Phil happen to Heather. I pulled hard on her wrist as she took another step towards the interior of the bakery. I tried to warn her, tried to say, "I just saw my mailman come out of there with a huge piece of his body missing. Just missing, Heather. You can't go in there. I don't know what's going on, but it's dangerous." That's what I tried to say, but deep down, I knew what was going to come out. The Butternut Bakery does not serve human flesh. 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 I pulled Heather even harder, and she fought back with as much force as she could. The shadows in the back of the bakery were moving faster now, even buzzing around the edges. Each were vibrating violently with some unseen energy. The yellow glow of lights burned brighter, so bright I had to squint. I thought of the blood trail I had seen drip from Phil's shoulder, the exposed bones and ligaments peeking through the mangled skin, the butcher lines drawn on his face, and I pulled with all my might. Heather lost her footing. We fell backwards, one on top of the other, hard on the pavement. The door she had opened slammed, as though sucked back like a vacuum. When it did, the bell at the top jingled violently, and the entire building jumped with the force of closure. And it was that flinch, that slammed door, that made the sign fall from the window. I saw the words, "The Butternut Bakery does not serve human flesh," one last time, in plain black text on a white background. Then I blinked, and it was gone. Not just the sign as falling. The entire building was gone. People were walking by us now, as though they hadn't seen what had happened. Instead, they only gave us odd looks and stepped over our bodies. I sat up and looked around. The main street of Habitsville was just as I had always known it, before I heard that phrase, the one I don't dare speak again. My name is Alan McGregor. It's the name I've given myself to protect my identity. It's also a name that's stuck with me since childhood, but that's for a different story. The one I'm going to tell you now, though, is quite harrowing. I've been with the FBI for years. It's a great agency filled with many fine, hard-working men and women, despite what you might hear on TV. I had been working the site for months. We had captured creatures pouring out of a hole in the desert, quickly built a small holding site so that they couldn't escape and hurt people. Why were we out there in the middle of nowhere? Well, without giving away too many details, We were investigating a case involving multiple deaths in a small town in Arizona. It led us to this hole in the desert. There were tunnels underneath that we explored. Our best guess is that the cannibals dug them, and their decision to do so seemed instinctual rather than cognitive-based. No one except the highest members of the FBI knew about this place. The site used the existing tunnels and fortified them. The cannibals were separated into various cells. Then, the speculation began. I developed a theory based on what I had seen in the caverns. The remains of a mutilated species that closely resembled humans. DNA testing seems to confirm this. Seemed to link to the killings we were investigating. Same method of limbs were being ripped apart. At the time of the initial investigation, something didn't add up, because it seemed the doors and windows had been opened, yet the killings seemed animalistic. Another strange aspect about these creatures was that their DNA closely matched those of convicted felons. Something didn't add up. Until one day, when one of the cannibals decided to talk. This cannibal had been very elusive, and we could not extract a DNA sample no matter how hard we tried. This particular day, it jumped onto the bars and held onto them like a feral animal. No one else was around in the cavern, and I reached for my gun as it clutched the bars tightly.
"You will see what we are capable of,"
the cannibal said.
"You cannot control us. You will pay for trying to."
I increased the number of agents that guarded this particular cannibal's cell, but it was of no use. Several days later, 5 agents were dead, the ones that had been guarding the cell, and several hours after that, I couldn't make contact with the agent stationed at the house of the killings. He was still trying to piece together the motivations of what happened. That day was horrible, because so much death occurred in a short amount of time. Another house on the edge of the desert suffered the same fate. Another family dead, limbs torn apart. At the crime scene, the words, "Call me Percy," were etched into the wall above one of the victims. I feel guilty covering up such a horrific scene, but the FBI couldn't risk letting this information see the light of day. The agency has done its utmost to hide all of this from the public, and even today, I can't confirm whether or not that was the right decision. Back at camp, I made some phone calls, had more agents sent to my location right away. We sealed off the tunnels immediately and decided to move camp about 10 miles away from the original site, in an effort to throw them off our scent until my team and I could figure out how to stop these creatures. But one of the cannibals was very persistent. I woke that following night to the sight of the cannibal's reddish-orange skin.
"Do you know my name?"
the cannibal asked, perfectly pronouncing the words as if it had spoken the language all its life. I thought for a minute, the fog in my head clearing. "Percy," I finally said.
"It is not my real name,"
Percy said.
"It is the one I choose to give you. If you knew my real name, you could control me. But you won't. You never will. Know my name."
It continued in a mocking laugh, which sounded like a cross between a human laughing and a dog barking. Since then, I've encountered Percy several times, and have not been able to pin it down so that a DNA sample could be extracted, thus illuminating his identity. Percy seems to be most aware of the cannibals, and guards his real name fiercely. I have tracked him to many states in the US, where various killings have been committed which fit the method that was used in the Arizona killings. I find myself cleaning up after a cannibalistic being that has no regard for human life. My superiors have told me to do this, and I'm finding it difficult to justify what I'm doing ethically. Officially, I have to obey their orders. Off the books, I'm trying to get the word out there. A horrible curse befell my girlfriend, and now she can only eat human meat, and I'm her personal butcher. It all started 2 years ago when my girlfriend became very ill and struggled to eat. Anything she did eat would usually come back up a few minutes later. At first, The doctors weren't sure what was wrong with her, theorizing it may be a stomach ulcer, but after her health continued to deteriorate, further tests revealed that it wasn't stomach ulcers, but instead stomach cancer. This news shattered our world. Never in a million years could we have guessed it would be cancer. Elaine was in her mid-20s, and I know that doesn't make you immune, but it sure makes you feel that way. The cancer was caught pretty late, and neither of us had a lot of money. Essentially living paycheck to paycheck, so our medical options weren't great. We live in Buffalo, meaning we were just 30 miles too far south for good and affordable medical care, and with Elaine unable to work, I made the choice to take on a second job as a nightly garbage collector. It didn't pay great, but beggars can't be choosers. It was at this job, however, that I met Eli Carson. Eli was a wild dude. He was only 30, but looked easily mid-40s. He had a shaved head with a singular rat's tail hanging out the back. His eyes were dark green, and his face had a long, thick scar going from his right brow down across the bridge of his nose, right down to his left cheek. The craziest thing about him, though, is that he grew up in a cult. A sort of offshoot of the Unification Movement cult set up by more eccentric members. He told me that he had been a member from birth and lived on a commune until he was 19, until he escaped. The stories he had from the cult made the night shift go by much quicker, but it was once I told him about Elaine's situation that the funny stories turned serious. Due to his cult links, Eli knew some pretty weird and out there people, and he put me on to someone who he said could cure Elaine 100%. Her name was Madame Arachnia. Eli described her as the craziest mix of genius and psycho I've ever met. He said that she worshipped eldritch gods and that she believed H.P. Lovecraft was not a fiction writer, but instead a prophet. However, he promised me that no matter how insane her beliefs were, that nobody else was better equipped to help. I got shot one night while out on a date, and I was set to be on crutches for 6 months, but she had me walking in no time. He claimed, though I doubted the veracity of his claim. However, Elaine was quickly running out of options, and I couldn't live with myself if we didn't try everything we could. So, what if it turned out to be a hoax? It wouldn't change anything about our current situation. Madame Arachnia worked out of a camp deep in a forest at Niagara Gorge. The camp was designed to look like a circus, including a big top tent. Fairy lights hung up all over the camp, connecting the multiple tents and teepees that were dispersed throughout. Up in the left corner, just beside the big top, was an animal pen that contained some sheep, goats, cows, and horses. Madame Arachnia's tent was situated at the back of the camp, guarded by 2 tall men dressed like jesters. However, instead of the usual colorful attire, they wore all black. They wore a skull mask and a vest made of bones, as well as a coal-black jester's hat with little skull bells that jingled as they walked. Both men carried 4 black balloons and 1 white balloon. They led me into the tent, which, unsurprisingly, was illuminated by multiple fairy lights draped across the roof. There was a strong smell of burning sage and lavender incense, and the floor was covered in hay that crunched whenever someone took a step. I had assumed that Madame Arachnia would be an old lady covered in warts, though that turned out to be very wrong. When she pulled down her shawl, she revealed a stunningly beautiful woman with a pale, freckled face, bright yellow eyes, and a tattoo of a black widow spider around her right eye. The sides of her head were shaved, with the jet black hair on top done into a quiff with a white streak dyed into it. Each one of her fingers wore a golden covering coated with encrusted gems, and she had the letters H and P tattooed on the back of her left and right hands respectively. "Samuel, I'm guessing," she said, while pulling off her shawl as I approached, her yellow eyes staring directly into mine, as if she was trying to gawk into my soul. "That's me, though most people call me Sam," I responded, while pulling out the wicker chair from under the table so that I could take a seat. "Well, Sam, I understand your dear Elaine has been attacked by a horrible disease," she replied, as she picked a small satin black sack off the floor and placed it on the table. the glass contents rattling around inside as she did. Yeah, stomach cancer. We've tried everything that we could afford, but nothing's worked, and I don't know how long she has left, I explained while biting my lip. I found it hard to discuss these matters with anyone without bursting into tears. Madam sat in silence with her fingers crossed for a few seconds to allow me to regain my composure. Once I did, she continued on. Cancer is a horrible thing. To me, it's the greatest evil in our universe. It turns our body against us and kills us slowly from the inside. A truly reprehensible disease. People beg their god to cure them, but more often than not, neither their god nor their doctor can do anything for them, she replied, as she put her hand into the sack and began to rummage around inside. However, the old ones would never allow a servant to die in such a horrible death. After rummaging around for a bit, she eventually pulled out a glass vial with a cardboard cork at the top. The vial was full of a crimson-red substance that swirled around in the glass. Madame Arachnia placed the vial into my hand, then, with her hand, she closed mine over the vial. She held my hand in between both of hers and looked at me in the eye again. I made this concoction especially for your Elaine. She should drink this as soon as possible, then rest. It'll clear all of her ailments and strengthen her stomach in no time. I'm not sure if it was her confidence, or my desire to want her to be correct, or maybe a mix of both, but at that moment, I completely believed Madame Arachnia that this was going to work. Thank you so much. What do I owe you? I asked her as I pulled an envelope out of my jacket which contained $3,000, my entire savings. Oh, monetary gain means little to me. Elaine's return to health will be of use to my gods. Appeasing them means much more to me than any piece of paper assigned an arbitrary value. Madame Arachnia replied as she lifted her hand up and gestured for me to put the money away. There had been many red flags from my trip to the camp, but this should have been the biggest. Nobody does anything for free, whether they take money or not in some way they expect to be rewarded for what they have done. However, at the time, I didn't think about that. I just thought that Madame was just some saint doing good acts in the name of some misplaced belief in fictional gods. However, how wrong I turned out to be. The first 4 days after Elaine had taken the potion were no different than usual, and I started to believe we had fallen for a stupid hoax. I was angry at myself for falling for such an obvious fake cure, and I was even angrier for having put Elaine through more stress, getting her hopes up again for nothing. On the 5th day, though, things changed for the better. Elaine woke up and seemed to be doing much better. The color had come back to her face, and she was full of energy. Her beautiful smile touched each one of her rosy red cheeks in the morning, when she woke me up to tell me how amazing she felt. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw how great she looked. If it weren't for the weight loss, you wouldn't have believed that she was a cancer patient. However, the good feelings didn't last as she immediately threw up when she ate some toast that I had made for her. We were both shocked when she threw up, and I could tell how much effort Elaine was putting in to stop herself from exploding into tears. It had seemed that we had found a cure, but after she threw up, it became apparent it had only been a placebo, except it wasn't. We decided to go to the doctor for a checkup, hoping that the potion may have fought back some of the cancer. Not enough to return Elaine's appetite, but enough to give her back some energy and to give us a fighting chance. However, when the test results came back, the doctors were dumbfounded. The cancer was completely gone. There was no trace at all. The doctors couldn't believe their eyes. Elaine sat in silent shock upon hearing the news, only coming out of it when I threw my arms over her. "I'm alive," she said, before beginning to cry as I held her tight in my arms. The doctors informed us that Elaine throwing up when eating was most likely just her body getting used to regular food again, and that it would return soon again. They told us to ensure that she only ate small portions, and soup for the time being, which is all she could usually stomach when she was sick. However, over the next few days, she couldn't even stomach that. 4 days had passed since she got the all clear, and she couldn't even eat some toast and soup. The rest of her body had been cured, but it seemed like her stomach had deteriorated. I decided I needed to meet with Madame Arachne again. If anyone had the answer, she would. I just wish it wasn't the answer she gave. When I reached the camp, I was once again greeted by the creepy jesters who walked me into Madame's tent once more. I explained to her that the potion had worked, but that Elaine couldn't eat no matter what we tried. Her response to this took my own appetite away from me.
Well, of course she can't eat. You aren't feeding her the right meat,
she said as she placed some tarot cards face down on the table, keeping her eyes focused on them as she spoke to me. Well, you never told me that there was food she couldn't eat. What can she eat? I replied, expecting to get an answer like horse or rat. However, the answer was much, much worse.
Humans,
she replied as she lifted her head to finally look at me and grin. My heart sank into my stomach upon hearing this, and I began to sweat profusely before lashing out in anger. Don't joke with me! I screamed as I jumped up from my seat and lashed a closed fist against the table, causing the tarot cards to fly off and onto the floor. Both of the jesters took a step forward, preparing to attack me, but Madame ordered them to step back before beckoning for me to take my seat again.
Sit down and relax, Sam. I'm not joking. My potions aren't a miracle. They cure, but they need something in return. In this case, Elaine's stomach has been modified to fight off all infections and diseases, but in return, she can only eat her fellow humans, she explained as she reached her right hand out and called for one of the jesters, who then carried over a lunchbox and placed it on the table, opening it up, revealing a liver. This is a human liver. Take it home and cook it for about 6 minutes on each side and then serve it. It'll be the tastiest meal Elaine has ever had, and once she has had the taste for human meat, she'll never want to go back. Not that she has a choice, Arachnia said before starting to chuckle as she placed the top back on the box and slid it across the table to me. The anger I felt before quadrupled as I sat there being mocked. However, I took a few deep breaths and composed myself, knowing that Madame's 2 goons might not be held back by her a second time if I lost it again.
And how do I know this is a human liver? This could easily just be a liver from one of your animals. I want you to stop playing around with me and give me a proper answer. Stop this frustrating joke, please. I calmly replied as I sat back in my seat and crossed my arms. Madame didn't immediately respond. Instead, she turned her head to look at the jester to the left of her and nodded to him. Once she did, he walked away to the back of the tent, coming back a moment later with a plastic bag slung over his shoulder. He walked up to the table and dropped the bag directly onto it. The full weight of the bag hit the tabletop with a loud thud before a head rolled out from it. A human head. Once the head rolled out, I leapt from my seat and screamed before the jester put both hands on my shoulder and forced me back down into the chair, ordering me to sit now with a hoarse voice.
We don't do jokes around here, Samuel. If I say something, I mean it,
Madame Arachnia said with a serious tone, though I was no longer looking at her. My eyes were transfixed on the detached head sitting on the table in front of me. The head looked to have belonged to an older man in his either late 40s or 50s, going off his wrinkled face and long gray hair with some spots of bald dispersed throughout. His facial expressions was one of the immense pain, and his eyes had been gouged out. I started to wonder what this man had done to earn such a fate, but that mattered little to me. What did matter, however, was how dangerous Madame Arachnia was. My right leg twitched uncontrollably underneath the table as she spoke, fearing that I may face the same fate as this man.
Now, take that lunchbox, leave this camp, and never dare return. The boys will see you out,
Madame Arachnia said as the jesters approached me and lifted me out of the chair. One of them handed me the lunchbox, before both walked me out of the camp and back to civilization. When I got home, I cooked the liver just as Madame had told me to, and just as she predicted, Elaine loved it, but more importantly, she was able to keep it down. I waited until the next day to see if she was able to keep it all down before sitting her down and explaining to her that she had consumed a man's liver. At first, she thought it was a joke, but once I assured her it wasn't, she understandably slapped me across the face, then stormed off, leaving me alone with a deep red hand-shaped mark on my face. She didn't return until later that night, but when she did, she was much calmer than when she left. It was that night that we accepted we only had two choices going forward. We could either do what we needed to be done, or allow Elaine to starve. The latter was never an option, and there was no plan B, so it was obvious that we would need to kill and keep Elaine alive. I said that I would do it, as I had gotten us into this mess. We are, or I should say, we both were pretty non-violent people, so just jumping straight into murdering people wasn't easy. We knew we couldn't just kill anyone. Elaine decided that we would choose certain people who deserved to die. So, that explains why I'm sitting in a parking lot across from a 24-hour gym at 1 a.m., waiting for the right person to leave. The right person was Jack Werther, a 33-year-old man and fitness aficionado. He needed to keep himself in top shape to impress the ladies, but when I say ladies, I should really say girls. Young girls. Jack usually likes them between 13 and 16, and he was into some pretty weird stuff. I know this because Jack has been texting back and forth with Elaine for the last 3 weeks, though he thinks she's a 14-year-old girl. I've done this a few times now, so you might assume I was getting used to it, but if I'm being honest, I dread doing this every time. I struggled to sleep for days once I noticed that meat is running low, though I thankfully don't have to do this often. A whole human lasts pretty long, but not as long as you'd hope, since it's all Elaine can eat. Most of the body can be used, bar the head, hands, and feet, which she struggles to eat, except the eyes, which she enjoys blended up like a smoothie. I had wished Elaine would have picked a weaker, less fitness-loving meal, but we take what we can get, and it's hard to survive multiple shots to the head from a hammer, no matter how strong and fit you are. I had to sit and wait for Jack for over 2 hours. During that time, my usual feelings of fear, anxiousness, and paranoia subsided as I tried to focus on even staying awake. However, Jack eventually left the gym and briskly walked up the quiet, empty street and into the darkness. Once I saw him leave, I grabbed the hammer out of my bag and followed after him. Time for dinner. Thanks for listening, Wolfpack. If you want to submit your own story, the links for my email and subreddit will be down below. I've also created a Discord, so if you want to join that, the link will be in the description down below as well. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And with that said, have beautiful nightmares, and I will see you next time.